Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being with me. For those who don't know me yet, my name is Ron Levine from Mindfulness in Blue Jeans. I've been practicing mindfulness and insight meditation for almost 25 years. And I started during a time when I was dealing with clinical anxiety and depression and panic disorder, which had blown up into agoraphobia. I was on disability from work. I was unable to leave the house. And happened to get paired up with a psychologist who had been teaching and practicing mindfulness and insight meditation for several decades, even back in the 90s, before most of us heard about mindfulness as a flavor of the month, right? And I had never heard of this stuff, and I thought it was crap. I mean, what the hell is this? But I gave it a shot, and I don't know, a quarter of a century later, here I am. So it's worked out pretty well for me. I'll keep it going a little while longer, I think. I'll keep doing it as long as it works. So this is the next in our ongoing series of calming anxiety by living mindfully. And it'll build a little bit on what we were doing last week. You don't have to have been here last week to get it. But if you were here last week, it'll build a little bit upon that. Now let's go ahead and jump in, okay? Let's begin, as we always do, by imagining that we are suspended from the ceiling by a piece of string attached to the top of our heads. There's a nice cue to sit up straight without adding any extra tension to do so. As always, if there is some tension here, that's allowed. Tension's allowed to be here. In fact, if we decide it's not allowed to be here, that just causes more tension anyway. So we might as well just allow whatever tension is here to be here. And what I'd like to do today is come right to the breathing. Now, as most of you know already, I practice and teach almost exclusively not trying to control the breathing. We can control the breathing. We do not have to. And it's worked out very well for me in my practice to simply observe the breathing as it is. Let it be. It's not easy. In fact, the more I practice letting the breath be, the more I notice more and more subtle levels of control and shaping of the breathing that I've been engaging in that I never really noticed before. We become a little more sensitive, a little more attuned to what we're doing. And similar with the tension and allowing it to be here, if I notice some controlling and shaping happening, I allow that to be there too. Otherwise, I fall into the trap of trying to control my controlling. Now, that is fairly challenging, at least it is for me. So one of the ways that I go about it builds upon what we were talking about last week. Last week we talked about putting in right effort instead of maximum effort. Perhaps sometimes we're trying too hard. Trying to get rid of tension forcefully. Trying to control our controlling. In my experience, those are examples of trying too hard. And sometimes when we bring our attention to the breathing, we run into trouble. And sometimes it's because we're trying too hard. So while we don't want to be careless with our attention, we don't need to overexert either. We're shining a light on something to see it more clearly. We're not trying to use X-ray vision to see straight through it. So I invite you to bring your attention to your breathing, but how lightly can we bring our attention to our breathing while still maintaining the attention? Think of using a gentle gaze rather than a piercing one. Can our attention be steady without being heavy? Can we maintain a singular focus on the breathing? Just one breath at a time. Without staring a hole right through it. riding it like a wave rather than trying to pin it down. I find that when I bring this lighter touch of attention to the breathing, it allows the breathing to flow and express more naturally. Maybe not right away, because we're not usually accustomed to engaging in this kind of attention to something. Usually we're either not paying attention at all, or we're so tightly focused on something. We're not really used to this middle path. And in fact, one of the ironies is that we end up bringing attention to how we're bringing attention. Kind of folds back in upon itself. As we're bringing this attention to the breathing, we're also evaluating the quality of attention that we're bringing. Are we putting in the right effort, or are we over-efforting? Are we under-efforting? And learning how to bring attention to the way we are bringing attention is a crucial life skill, in my experience. When the Buddha talks about karma, the three pillars of karma are intention, attention, and perception. We're largely basing our intention upon our perception. We do what we do based on the way things seem to be. But where's our perception coming from? Well, it's coming from our attention, isn't it? So if we're not paying attention well. You notice that's what we call it, paying attention. If we are overpaying our attention somewhere, if we are underpaying our attention somewhere, how's that going to work out for our perception? How accurate will our perception be? If our perception's not accurate, then, well, our intentions aren't being informed well. And then our thoughts and speech and actions, well, they're based on those intentions, so, well, that's not going to end well. And that in turn affects our skill of paying attention, and the cycle continues. So that's what we're here to see. That's what we're here to maybe change. So how are we going to do that? Well, we can start here by improving our skill of attention. And that's kind of the nice thing about a vicious cycle, is that you don't really have to change the whole cycle yourself. You just change one part of it. And that affects the rest of it. So just learning how to adjust the intensity of our attention to our breathing. Which in turn builds the skill of learning how to pay the right amount of attention to other things. That's enough to change our whole life experience. Almost doesn't seem possible when we think about it. And yet, it's been my experience. So, the way I was thinking about it originally was, in fact, just another misperception. Which got corrected by paying the right amount of attention. Figuring out what was right effort. if you lose the breathing, which we all do. Me too. If you lose it, you come back. We notice the quality of the breathing. We notice the quality of the attention we're bringing to it. Do we need to turn it up a little bit? Do we need to turn it down a little bit? Maybe it was actually just fine the way it was. We happen to lose the breathing. We come back and continue at that same level. Perhaps the level that is right today isn't right tomorrow. That's why this is an ongoing practice. We don't just find the right amount of effort today and use that forever on everything. It's ongoing experimentation. But it's a skill. We get better at it. So we're not always putting the same amount of effort into figuring out what the right amount of effort is, as we get better at it. Like any other skill, it becomes easier, become more familiar, becomes more automatic. And if you feel like you don't know what you're doing, none of this makes sense, that's okay. Even that series of thoughts, even that feeling, is something that we can bring attention to. It's allowed. It's no better or worse than anything else. We're practicing our skill of attention. So if that's what's here, okay, we practiced our skill of attention on that. And we see what happens. Maybe something groundbreaking. Maybe nothing discernible at all. And again, it's less about what kind of effect happens, and more about the fact that we are engaging in the process of practicing our attention with it. As you go through the rest of your day, you may notice what comes up internally, externally. And the quality of attention that you're bringing to these phenomena? How much attention are you paying? Are you overpaying? Are you underpaying? We have a finite amount of attention, so we want to pay the right amount. We don't want to give too much away without proper return. But we don't want to underpay either. Missing out on some information that we need to inform our perception, which will inform our intention. So we have better karmic experience. But again, it's a cycle. So we can have the intention to work with our attention, exactly as we're doing here. So I invite you to bring that intention with you to continue experimenting, working with your attention, both on and off the cushion. And see how that guides your path. Thank you, everyone. I'll hang on for a few moments if some folks have some questions or observations to share in the chat. Well, Ava, hey Ava, good to see you. How do we get our panic mode to decrease? That's a great question. I will share with you an experience that I had that was one of my most profound early experiences that made a huge difference for me. When I was housebound, when I started this practice, started working through opening up to things like discomfort again, because what ultimately got me housebound was I was trying not to feel discomfort ever again. So I was dealing with this continuous panic, and if I was out of the house, I would feel panic. And the further away from the house I was, the more panic I would feel. You know, being afraid of having a public meltdown and that sort of thing. I can't get home fast enough, that sort of thing. So I started to avoid going far from home. But as I stopped going far away from home, my comfort zone decreased. So what at one point didn't feel far from home now felt far from home. So in an attempt to not feel discomfort, the discomfort of panic and fear of panic, I kept staying closer and closer to home until it finally got to the point where I was trapped at home. I had no comfort zone anymore. So one of the things I started to discover as I started this practice and started working with trying to get out of the house again, I started to find that I had to be willing to experience some level of discomfort, because obviously trying to avoid any kind of discomfort wasn't sustainable. That didn't work. Had the opposite intended effect. And one of the first things that I found was, if I put myself in an uncomfortable situation, which at that point was literally just walking around the block of our apartment, that was horrifying. What I found was, okay, after I do this thing that's really scary, now I actually feel some comfort afterwards. I started to realize, comfort's just that thing that I feel after I've experienced discomfort. There is no comfort without discomfort. In fact, too much comfort, I have found, becomes uncomfortable. So I started working my way out into the world again. Again, walking a block around the house, walking 2 blocks, walking 3 blocks, starting to drive again a little bit. After, I don't know, a month, 6 weeks of this, I drove. I call this my Newton Center story when I tell it. So I live here in Waltham, Massachusetts. And one day I was like, okay, let me see if I can drive to Newton Center, which is, Newton's the next town over. It's actually the town I grew up in. And it's about, I don't know, maybe a 15-minute drive without any traffic. Now, a 15-minute drive for me at that point was pretty damn scary. It was the furthest I'd driven and been away from the house in, several months. And I drove over to the Newton Center train stop, which is on this it's on this block that has like a strip of shops on it and stuff. And I was like, all right, I'll drive over there and I'll just like go into 1 or 2 of the shops or something and then just come home. So I made it there, which in itself was a feat, and went into this gift shop that was there. And there was one of those carousels that had greeting cards on it. So I'm like, all right, I'll look at the greeting cards. And I start, twirling the carousel and looking at the greeting cards. I'll never forget, I had this moment where I was like, if I start to melt down now, I can't get home fast enough. I'm screwed. And, of course, this was the panic voice. And I realized, well, shit. I can't get out of here fast enough. And for the first time since I had started making my way out of the house again, for the first time I really thought to myself, I've gone too far. I've gone too far. I shouldn't have done this. At this point, I'd been practicing for a couple of months, and there was a part of me, just enough of me, that felt a little bit of annoyance, anger, maybe, frustration, and a recognition, if not an outright acceptance, of the truth of what I was realizing. Yeah. If I start to have a panic attack right here, it's going down. and we're putting on a show for these people, whoever was in the shop at the time. And I thought to myself, you know what? Here I am talking to myself, ultimately, really, right? But I'm talking to the panic voice. Say, you know what? You're right. You're absolutely right. I can't get out of here fast enough. If this is going to happen, this is going to happen, and it's going to happen right here. So if it's going to happen right here, I'm just going to watch it. So, you know what? Go ahead. Go ahead. Do it. Panic. Go ahead. What do you got? And almost immediately, I felt like 30 pounds dropped off my shoulders onto the floor. And my entire body just eased. And I looked down. I'm like, what the hell's going on? Like, I just relaxed. And I was like, what the like, what? And it dawned on me that the problem was not the panic in and of itself. The problem was the fight that I was bringing in anticipation of it. I was looking for a fight and I found it. And there's this quote that I mention sometimes, which is horribly dark and isn't necessarily, I wouldn't necessarily base your life upon this, but it's a quote that's always stuck with me, which is, the quickest way to end a war is to lose it. And there was this moment where I surrendered. I dropped my weapons. And wouldn't you know, when I dropped my weapons, there was no war to be had anymore because, well, it was really just me all along. Who was I fighting? I was fighting myself. So if I drop my weapons, who's left to fight? Well, nobody. And that's what I finally did. I reached this stage where I was genuinely willing to experience the sensations of panic. And wouldn't you know, the instant I was willing to experience the sensations, they fell away. Now, that's not something that we can necessarily just turn on and turn off. I had been practicing for a little bit at that point. It was an incredibly profound experience and one that I still take with me to this day. Because it's not like I don't feel sensations of panic. Anyway, it comes up now and then. I mean, not very often anymore, but it comes up now and then. I certainly experience anxiety on a regular basis. That's not any different, It's how I relate to them. And a large part of that relating to is, oh, well, wait a minute. Do I have to fight this thing by default? Do I have to shoot first and ask questions later? Can I just check it out? And this all ties into why I teach and practice the way I do with the breathing. Do I have to fight the breathing? Do I have to control the breathing? Do I have to shape the breathing? No, I don't. And again, that's part of why it was so profound for me to work with the breathing that way. It was because of experiencing panic disorder for almost a decade. I'd become very accustomed to shaping and controlling the breathing because one of the signs of panic was, oh, the breathing gets too fast. Can't let that happen. So that's where this whole non-controlling of the breathing in my practice comes from. It's like, oh, wow, holy shit. Because that was scary to start practicing without controlling the breathing. Like, don't control the breathing. You're freaking crazy. That could lead to panic, And it just snowballs. Again, it's another vicious cycle. So one of the big tricks there, the caveat that I want to give when I relay this story is it has to be a genuine openness, a genuine willingness, a genuine curiosity to see what's here. We can't go into it saying, okay, I'm willing to let you do your thing, but just so that you leave. It's got to be this genuine interest, this genuine, no, let's see what this is. Let's really see what this is. And what it is, inevitably, always, is a process. And what do processes do? They process. And what happens when we fight with the process? It takes a lot longer to process. This is where that saying, what you resist persists, comes from. If we resist a process, it's not going to stop. It's just going to take a hell of a lot longer to get through what it came to get through because we're getting in its way. So, a practice like this where we are bringing a gentle attention to the breathing process without necessarily trying to interfere with it. I think that was the foundation that set me up to be able to do what I did in that gift shop that day. And that's why these seemingly very basic, inconsequential perhaps practices are actually hugely consequential. If we can sit and observe the breathing without trying to interfere, that scales out. We become able to look at all kinds of things, all kinds of experiences, good and bad, scary, and just see what they're actually like, rather than immediately picking up our weapons, looking for a fight, and finding it, finding the exact one that we brought. So, kind of a long answer, but that was still the most profound, almost 25 years ago, that was still the most profound experience I had that showed me, oh, this is how I can effectively work with panic. Let it be here if it arises and check it out. That's what I found. And that takes some practice. It's not something we just jump right into. You have to feel your way into it. Even that's something we want to do skillfully. You may not be in a place to do that yet. Maybe right now we just stick with the breathing. So I'm not saying rush headlong into something like this. It's just the way it worked out for me. So something to keep in mind. Something to perhaps work with, something to perhaps keep in your back pocket to work with later. But I hope that helps in some way. At least not how I found out about meditation. When I finally had my big meltdown, I was trapped at home and on disability and so forth, that I happened to get paired up with a psychologist who had been teaching and practicing mindfulness and insight meditation for 30 years. And that's how this all started. And I myself at the time was like, what the hell is this mindfulness stuff? This sounds stupid. Like, what? I need help, man. What are you giving me here, dude? So I myself had no particular confidence or conviction or faith or what have you in this practice. And in some ways, my practice developed very quickly, I think, partially because of that. I didn't have any expectation. I had no expectation. So when I actually did it, I wasn't trying to accomplish anything because I didn't think it was going to do anything anyway. And things started happening very quickly. And that comes down to what I often say about this practice is it's a practice of seeing, not looking. I think I started to see very quickly, partially because I was not looking for any particular result. I just didn't think it would have any. So because I wasn't looking, I started seeing a lot fast. And my practice took off very quickly. How many years ago? This was the spring of 1998. The day I collapsed was April 20th, 1998. I have a thing for dates. Yeah, April 20th of 1998. It was a Monday morning. I drove into work. I'd been spiraling out of control for several months at this point. And I drove into work that morning, took off my coat, sat down in my chair, looked at the clock. It was about 8 a.m. And I realized quite matter-of-factly that there was no way in hell I was making it to the end of that day. And I stood up, I put on my coat, I drove home, and had to have a very difficult phone call with my boss. And I mean, my work couldn't have been better about it. They were fantastic. But at this point, my anxiety and my panic, these things were my deep, dark secret. I didn't talk about these things. So for me to have a conversation with my boss and explain I couldn't come into work anymore because I was freaking out, panicking. I mean, that was... Yeah. And saw my new psychologist the following day, the 21st. That was the first day I saw him. And I think it was the day after that, I want to say, because I saw him like 2 days in a row. I believe it was the following day that he took me through my first sitting. And I didn't get anything out of it. I was like, what the hell are we doing? And then he said, all right, so try to do this at least once or twice a day at home. Like, okay. And it was the next morning when I did my first solo sitting that things started to break apart very quick, in a good way. Things started to loosen up and shake loose, like right in that first solo sitting. And I was like, oh, whoa. Like, what ended up happening was towards the end of the sitting. Well, the first thing that happened was I saw how I was fighting myself. So it became kind of a precursor to what happened in the gift shop a couple of months later. I saw how much I was fighting myself and how much fatigue and exhaustion that was causing. And some of the things that were triggers for my panic and anxiety were fatigue and exhaustion. So again, another vicious cycle. I was causing myself so much fatigue and exhaustion fighting this thing that was causing fatigue and exhaustion, and so I saw that. And that's when I had my first ever insight in this practice, right in those first 10 odd minutes or so, which was if you fight yourself, you've already lost. My first ever insight in this practice. If you fight yourself, you've already lost. I saw how I was fighting myself, and I was the one causing these problems. But then towards the end of the sitting, a few minutes later, I still remember the sitting was 17 minutes because I looked at the clock at the beginning and the end. So 17 minutes, which for me these days is like a blink, but back then it felt like hours. Towards the end of the sitting, I felt this sudden rush of hope. I hadn't felt hopeful in months. And I was like, holy crap, like where did this come from? There was suddenly this little ray of hope that there might be a way out of this. And I was shocked. And after the sitting, I'm thinking to myself, well, geez, I've been like freaking out for months. And then I sat for 17 minutes. And I saw this fighting and I felt this hope. I'm like, holy crap. So what else is in here waiting to be seen? And it just took off from there. And again, I saw these things because I wasn't looking for anything. So I was fortunate in that sense. I was fortunate in a sense that I thought this practice was bullshit. I had no expectations. I was fortunate because then I was able to see clearly very quickly. And right from there, that really set the foundation for my practice. And it took off very quickly. Yeah, I see Chris. Yeah, everything Chris is saying here, paradoxical relaxation, hiding your secret. Yeah, all this stuff. And by the way, not all the time, but I would say well over 90% of the time, like 98% of the time, I found that when I actually shared the secret, which of course these days I'll tell anybody and everyone, and try and get me to stop sharing it now. Overwhelmingly, the reactions that I received, rather than being the ones that I expected, where people start to shy away from you and look at you funny, overwhelmingly, the reactions I received were either, I'm going through something like that too, or I've been through something like that, or someone else very close to me is experiencing something like this. And of course, these days, it's not as good as it could be, but these days it seems it's a lot better than it was 25, 30 years ago, where people share a lot more about, we're all feeling anxiety. We all feel these things, right? I mean, not always necessarily clinical anxiety. Some of us experience clinical anxiety and depression, as I did. Some of us are experiencing situational anxiety and depression, as we all do, right? We're humans. We all got something. And if you're a human and you don't got something, there's something wrong with you. If you're a human and there's nothing wrong with you, you got something wrong with you, right? I'll close out with this. Were you just sitting by yourself in silence, focused on the breath? Largely, yeah. In this practice is sort of a combination of a couple of practices, anapanasati and vipassana. So anapanasati is breath meditation. And there's a very specific practice involved with that I don't usually get too deeply into. I don't consider myself a master of it by any means. Not that I'm a master at any of this, but I focus more on Vipassana, which is typically translated as insight meditation. And sometimes people say, well, what do you practice? Do you practice breath meditation or insight meditation? Are you focusing on the breathing, or are you focusing on this clear seeing? And what I find is it's not an either or. I start with the breathing, and simply by coming to the breathing, that sets the stage for insight to arise, like the insights I was talking about a couple of minutes ago. Because we don't get to say how insights arise, when insights arise, what insights are going to arise. That's part of the very nature of insight. If we're controlling it, it's not really an insight. So coming to the breathing, partially because of what we're doing, which is focusing our attention on one area, but also largely because of what we're not doing, which is focusing on all these other areas that we're often focusing on, our rumination and our worrying about the past, worrying about the future, because we're not doing that for a few minutes. That sets the stage for insights to arise. And some of the insights that arise are, oh, wow, look how effective it is to just come to the breathing. And then that helps reinforce the breathing meditation. So there's breathing and there's insight, and I find that working with the breathing leads to the insight. And some of those insights are about how effective it is to look at the breathing. So it all kind of works together. Folks, I'm going to wrap it up there. We are at just about an hour. This has been wonderful. It seems like this has resonated with a lot of folks. And this is the first time I've shared this particular practice where we're really focusing almost exclusively on the quality of attention that we're bringing. So I'm happy to have had you folks with me on this journey, as I'm always happy to have you with me on this longer journey that we're all sorting out for ourselves and for each other. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Cheers, everybody. Thanks so much. Take care.